Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm just wondering, have you ever done something in one of your worm bins that really made you kind of question what the heck were you thinking? It's kind of what I'm looking at here. It was 29 days ago that I had taken a number of brand new bins that I had purchased the day prior, and then I kind of set them all up as new habitats for launching new worm composting bins. And this is one of them that I built 29 days ago. And it looks like at that time I must have had no leaves or anything natural to put into my new system that I built here, because it's pretty much all kind of cardboard, paper towel tubes, newspaper, and then when you look underneath this kind of top sheet of newspaper, you start to see signs of what was probably different types of food items that I had placed in here 29 days ago. The stems of the bananas are clearly identifiable. As is the little specks of grit that I threw in here, little bits of eggshell. But it's been priming, basically. It's what I refer to it as. Just been kind of priming and waiting for the inhabitants to be introduced. And I got a feeling that the worms are actually going to really like this the way it is, because it's all a whole bunch of material that's already had a lot of time to just sort of get all soaked with juices, and there's probably all kinds of bacteria and fungi living in here. I believe I see some signs of different types of fungi living in here. So I do have a little supply of leaves that I could use to give this sort of a slight natural appearance after I introduce the worms. But on that topic, that is what I'm here to do today. I want to launch off some worms into this bin, and it's the worms that I've got in my so-called mixed bin of worms. And let me just really quickly show you what I'm talking about here. I created a little sketch, just a little scribble scratch listing of different information about the bin that I'm going to pull out here off the shelf in a moment. It's my 159-day-old bin in which I've got a mix of different types of worms. It's red wigglers, European night crawlers, and Indian blue worms. It's a little different from most of my bins, because usually after I let a bin go through its what I consider to be its composting phase, prior to trying to migrate the worms out of the bin, I usually have sort of a foraging stage where I don't feed for a while. I let the worms work the material down. But it was 21 days ago that I decided that I wanted to just switch straight from composting mode into migration mode. I had some weird things going on down here in my wormery, and I was panicking that that bin might take ill and that the worms in there might be in jeopardy, basically. So I wanted to try to start moving them out of that material. And over the past 21 days, it does seem like the worms have come together quite nicely. So before we put this board aside, my little scribble scratch board, I just wanted to also note that the system that we're going to check on, that we're going to pull worms out of, had received 21 feedings. I always treat the food that was in the bin as the first feeding, even though it even predates the worms being introduced. So the bin that we're going to pull up here had food introduced. It was treated as its first feeding. And during its composting phase, it had received 17 feedings. And then to facilitate this migration, there was the original load of food placed into the edge of the bin, and then 2 more subsequent additions of food. Adding it all together, it brings us to a total of 21 applications of food so far to that system. And I don't think we're going to add fresh food to that system today. I think there's probably enough leftovers in there, but we will pick the leftovers out and separate them from the worms so we can rebuild the feeding zone to let that migration in that bin continue, so we can keep trying to lure worms out of the finished compost. But let's put this new bin aside. Kind of doesn't look like a new bin, does it? So we'll go get the bin that we're going to migrate worms out of today. All right, and that's this bin right here. So the worms in here seem to be doing pretty good, but in a lot of my other systems I was having a lot of troubles, and that was the reason I sort of skipped the whole foraging step that I usually do, and I went straight to migrating. And I'm glad to say that so far I've seen no signs of any sort of problem in here. And I'm going to Just knock on wood, so I don't want to jinx that. But so far so good as far as I can tell in terms of the worms in here looking pretty decent. I was in here a number of times recently, not only to build up the feeding zone that I was trying to lure the worms into, but also to try to rescue worms out of the other systems that I was having problems with. This was the target environment that I had placed all those rescued worms into. And the only weird thing in here, I think, is a little bit of a kind of a cohabitation with the worms. A number of different types of insects, flying insects, crawling around here and there, mites. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to deal with the flying insects quite yet, but to deal with the mites, I've got neem cake that I've been using in most of my systems. I could see some signs of it here and there. I've been sprinkling it pretty liberally into most of my system to try to feed it to the mites, because when you feed it to the mites, supposedly it interferes with their ability to reproduce. So I've been incorporating the use of that stuff into all of my systems lately to see if I can cut down the number of mites that I see in my bins. So I've got a couple tubs over here. I'm going to pretty much excavate the entire contents of this feeding area here. I refer to it sometimes as the horizontal migration feeding zone. It's quite a mouthful. And then I'm going to proceed to try to pick out large chunks of food and whatnot that I think can just be sort of recycled and put back in here to keep this migration effort going. And then hopefully we'll minimize what we've collected here by reducing it down to more of sort of a worms only collection here after we pick out the large chunks of bedding and food that we can rebuild the feeding zone with. So I wonder if it might be easier to do that after each handful, because once this thing is full it might be a little difficult to pick through it. So why don't we do that? After I excavate a handful of material here, I'm just going to really loosely go through it and take, you know, large chunks of bedding like this coffee filter here. That's what I believe it is. And whatever, if we bring back a couple worms, it's not the end of the world. At least they're where we want them, which is in the feeding area. Here we have a banana peel. Looks like we had some rice. I'm always kind of reminded of how I had built up these feeding zones and bins and stuff. I don't always recall right at the tip of my tongue how things were done in the past, so as I'm rummaging through, I'm often reminded of what I had done recently in the recent past. So we can see some of the stuff: banana peels, leaves. Here's some of the stems of leaves, coffee filters, some of the things that have been used to build up this migration feeding zone over here. But we don't got to go nuts. A lot of this stuff is very minute particle matter type stuff, which would be a pain to try to separate from the worms. So I think what we will be doing when we finish here is we'll be releasing a number of worms along with a lot of the material that they're inhabiting, which should be fine too, because that new bin that they're being moved into does seem like it would benefit from having a little bit of more material. It's a little skimpy on the build. But over time that'll change. I'll just continue adding food and bedding to that system, and we'll build it up over time. But in the beginning it does seem like it is a little bit small, a little bit of a small system that we're putting all these worms into. Maybe I'll have to replenish my leaf supply so that I can throw a whole bunch more leafy material into that new bin after we launch these worms into it. I've just been, I was a little sketchy on using the leaves out of my yard for a while, but I had adopted a new trick maneuver. So every time I bring leaves in now, I always make a pit stop in the kitchen at the microwave oven. And I zap those leaves before bringing them down here. And I believe that by doing so, I pretty much sterilize that stuff of any hitchhiking creatures that might be inhabiting it. At least that's what I'm hoping. So I think between the sterilization of the leaves that I've been hauling in from outside to reduce the mite numbers, as well as the neem cake that I've been adding to all of my bins lately, my hope is that I've kind of got a recipe for the reduction of the mites in my worm bins, which will hopefully be realized in a short while, because it's my understanding that the way that neem cake works is that you don't wipe out the mites immediately by applying it. What you're really doing is interfering with the ability of the mites to reproduce by giving them that stuff. So the mites won't vanish immediately. It'll just be that next generation of mites not being spawned off as a result of using the neem cake, supposedly. And boy, oh boy, do I hope that stuff works. It'll be a happy day down here in my wormery when I start to see fewer and fewer mites. And I believe I'm already seeing fewer and fewer mites, even after only maybe, I don't know, a week or two of starting into the application of the neem cake into my systems. And after a few weeks of treating the leaves that are inbound to my wormery by microwaving this stuff. So, I'm not sure how many worms we've managed to haul out here, but it does seem like a fair number. And it also seems like we've also managed to recycle a good bit of material that we can rebuild this feeding zone with. Every time I look at the worms that are in this system, I try to get a sense of the ratio of, you know, how many red wigglers, how many Indian blue worms, and how many European night crawlers. The European night crawlers are pretty easy to spot because they're so large and chunky in size. But I must admit that I don't really see many of them. Once in a while I'll spot one, but they're sort of few and far between. Even the red wigglers, I question how many red wigglers are in this system. I almost feel like it's kind of dominated by the Indian blue worms. So I'm just wondering if there's maybe a little bit more that we can pull out of here. Yeah, we got another couple worms in that last handful. But I do want to take all this large, chunky, leafy, and vegetable matter, fruits, bedding, whatever it was that I built this feeding zone with, and return it back down here to enable this migration to continue. Not bad. So, who knows how many worms we've got in here. Hopefully a pretty good number. It's going to be difficult to estimate how many worms this new system has in it because we don't really have the luxury of having a nice clean worm-only sort of a release here. We are going to be releasing the worms with a whole bunch of that stuff that they're inhabiting. And that's fine. Over here on the edge, you can certainly see there's a good number of worms still needing to exit the finished compost. And usually I don't want to really stir up all the contents of the bin because the worms that are already here on the edge near the feeding area are pretty close to where I want them, you know, over into the migration feeding zone. They've already come pretty close to exiting the finished compost. And when we were in here the other day, we also looked over here into the finished compost, and we did notice that to a large degree at least, the stuff over on the far end was very devoid of any worms, right? So it does seem like it's working. Look at that big boy. So as I like to do, I'm just gonna take some of the more dry stuff that's out on the surface here and sink it down low, bringing up the more damp stuff that's down below, continuing with the drying of the material. And I also like to try to kind of break it up a little bit, make it a little bit less clumpy while I'm at it. And every time it dries out a little bit more, it becomes that much easier to sort of declump the stuff. And holy cow. So I don't know how much longer this migration is going to take. I suppose if there had been that intermediate phase of foraging, then the worms could have, you know, possibly worked this material down a little bit further to make it a little bit scarce in terms of how much remaining food bits are in it still. But since I went straight from kind of composting to migration, I kind of went into that knowing that the material that the worms were inhabiting was still kind of chock full of bits and pieces of food, which, you know, could ultimately hinder them from wanting to migrate out of the material. But I think all in all, the migration's coming along nicely in here. It's going to take a little longer than some of my other migrations have happened in the past, but that's fine. And I definitely like the way the material is beginning to dry out too. So I tried to sort of do that stirring and agitation of the material in such a way that I didn't really bring a lot of the worms back over to the far end of the bin. I did try to keep things sort of segmented the way they were when we first got into here. So we've got to restore our feeding area. We've got a whole bunch of nicely primed material that we could use to do this with. Let's just dump it right back in. I don't even know if it's necessary to enhance this feeding zone much. I thought about maybe adding some more bedding or some more food, but I mean, I was just in here a few days ago doing just that. So I believe that it's in pretty good shape right now. It should continue luring worms over. It's pretty nice, and I'll probably come back in here at some point soon too to kind of nudge it back over and help it along by adding some fresh food and fresh bedding. But right now I just wanted to do a extraction of the worms and then sort of put it all back the way we found it, more or less. That piece of paper there is not really meant to prevent worms from getting over there because it's full of holes, and the worms can get around it or past it pretty readily if they want to. So I usually don't see those as a barrier per se. To me, it's more like just a dividing line to see where the finished compost ends and where the feeding area begins, and try to like kind of limit the amount that stuff commingles. But yeah, I think this is coming along pretty good. So what do we got here? We've got this piece of paper towel that I had covered up the feeding zone with last time we were in here, so we'll use that as the cover this time. And then we had this piece of paper which is getting pretty withered on the side that's covered with plastic, where the recirculation of the moisture over the feeding zone is occurring. So between the material out in the bin drying and the material over in the feeding zone being able to retain its moisture level, the worms will hopefully continue getting attracted over into here. This is pretty annoying too, all these flying insects that have made themselves at home inside this plastic bag. I wonder if I could just sort of seal off the opening to the bag a little bit, just so that doesn't really continue that way. I don't really want to promote that sort of stuff. At some point soon I'm going to have to adopt some sort of a process for dealing with these flying bugs too. And it's probably going to be that stuff that you put into your outdoor pond, that BTI stuff that kills mosquitoes too and their larvae. But right now I'm still not equipped to start battling the flying insects yet. I will be soon, but for now I've just got to tolerate them, unfortunately. But yeah, let's go ahead and get that new bin out here that we're going to release our worms into, and then we can introduce them to their new home. Oh gosh, these new bins, they're so light. You just lift it with one hand, you know, because it's got, you know, nothing in it basically. It's very different from a brand new bin that's got all the worms in it, and it's heavy with the castings and the worms. So this is where we're going to be releasing our worms into. I've got this feeling that they're going to probably want to hang out in this material that they're in right now for a little while before they want to explore all this stuff around them. But who knows? Maybe they're going to take a shine to this stuff. It's certainly had enough time to break down. All this cardboard's got little perforations and corrugation and stuff that they might want to squirm inside of. And then we'll top it all off with some fresh leaves. So hopefully they'll enjoy their new home. And in time we'll build it up nicely for them to have more space to wander around in. So like I said, it's going to be a little bit difficult to gauge how many worms we're releasing here, because a lot of times I try my best to reduce the release of worms so that there's not so much of this random other material surrounding them. We have a much clearer view of how many worms we've released. So let's see if we can help ourselves get a little closer to that by maybe skimming off some of this stuff on the top that they've kind of exited because of the bright lights overhead, although I think we're kind of getting down to where the majority of the worms are. And maybe just by inverting the container, maybe we'll end up seeing more worms. Maybe a lot of them have made their way down to the bottom. So we'll turn this thing over now and cut them loose into their new home. All right, boys, here we go. Okay, I think we actually managed to get them all. And this is our one chance to sort of try spreading out the worm haul to get a better view of how many worms we've got here. And it's hard to say, I don't know. I'd love to hear people's ideas on how many worms they believe we've got running around over here. It's got to be, gosh, I don't know. You know, you poke down into some of these little piles, it is pretty dense, so they're not all clearly visible. Sometimes I'll try to stir it up a little bit so we can get a little better view of them, because they are kind of in little jumbles here and there. And just by the movement of them too, you could see how many of them are the blue worms, because they're just so mobile, they're so quick. But whatever, let's give them a moment or two here to dive down into the material, make themselves at home, and then we'll be done here. Well, that was pretty quick. I just came back from the sink, rinsing off these tubs that we used for this, and I did find one worm in the process. We're going to return him to all of his friends and neighbors. And then, let's see, the only other thing I wanted to do here before we close up shop is put a little bit of, just a little bit of fresh leafy material out here, just to give this stuff a little bit more of a natural appearance. I did also notice that there was a little bit of fluid kind of collecting down on the bottom of the bin from some of the, you know, the food items that were already in the process of decomposing in here. So I thought that maybe just by adding a little bit of dry material into here in the form of that dry leafy stuff, that we can see some of that moisture get wicked up into the dry leaves. And, you know, I don't even know about these pieces of paper as far as them being like viable top coverings anymore. They're pretty pretty far gone from having been soaked so thoroughly. So maybe they'll just get mixed in as bedding as well. And maybe we can even scatter a little bit more dry leafy stuff across the top. It does seem like there's a good amount of moisture that needs to be absorbed within this system. And even though now that it's starting to warm up, and the air is becoming a little bit more humid here in the house. And as a result, I've been sort of doing away with a lot of the plastic covers in my systems. Here, I believe I am going to just try to preserve as much of the moisture that's in here as possible by keeping a pretty thorough cover on this, at least for a short while. Just to enable the moisture that's down at the bottom to try to evaporate, get caught, condense, and then come back down and hopefully get sucked up by some of that leafy material. And I think that the moisture level in here should level out pretty nicely. And, you know, I didn't see any mites, so I'm not really worried too much about it, but I will probably get into applying some of this neem cake with the first feeding that this bin gets at some point in the near future. So, there's only one thing that remains, right? And that is the application of the customary label to show what kind of worms we've got inside the bin, and to show what the bin's launch date was. So please join me in welcoming the newest member of my wormery family. All right, everyone, that's it for today. I hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.